Okay, everybody, welcome to our class on modern day Israel. And this is obviously a part of our wider trek through Jewish history. So I believe this is our 19th class for those who have been following the whole time. For those who this is a one-off time, you can feel free to find the other videos, and hopefully putting together the last 18 chapters of history will build up to obviously the start of Israel and everything we're going to be talking about today. Just a couple of introductory points before we go into our discussion. So this class is also semi in honor of Yom HaAtzmaut. So Israel turned 75 yesterday. And so this is obviously, even from the start, from 1948, this is all really modern history. Even to the extent we were talking before that some people here might remember the founding of Israel. Certainly once we get into some of the later wars, 1967, 1973, some of the major turning points of what ended up creating modern day Israel. And so we've really entered into our, again, trek through Jewish history, starting in 4,000 years ago. We finally made it to modernity, and we can really discuss both the history of Israel, how Israel in 1948 differed and cultivated the Israel we find today in 2023. We discussed, I think, 2 times ago, a lot of the ideological foundations of Zionism, and then also a lot of the origins of the Zionist movement. So everything from even pre-Herzl in Europe in the 1880s, all the way to 1948. So I'm going to start right at 1948 today. But if anybody's thinking, well, hey, how did they get there? And how were governmental institutions created? And how do they all of a sudden have an army? You can find all that 2 and 3 classes ago, and I'll be sure to share all of the links. So I wanted to start off today. I usually like starting off with some Jewish texts. And so I wanted to start off today with a very new, but equally as important Jewish text. And it might come as no surprise to a lot of people here, but that is the Israeli Declaration of Independence, which is such a beautiful document, which we'll see in a second. And just two things I want to say at the outset about the Israeli Declaration of Independence before we go into reading it and then discussing it is the Israeli Declaration of Independence is in some ways even more important than the American Declaration, because Israel doesn't have a constitution, which for anybody who's been following the news coming out of Israel over the past 4, 5, 6 months, in terms of the attempted judicial reform and then the anti-reform protests. And I actually think today there was about 250,000 people in Jerusalem doing a pro-judicial reform protest. So for anybody here who's been following and paying attention to Israeli news, one of the main friction points of this judicial reform debate is the fact that Israel never had a constitution. But in a lot of ways, the Supreme Court in Israel does and has used this Declaration of Independence as sort of a quasi-constitution. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but this is the foundational document of Israel and Israel's values. And that gets into the second point, which is we discussed a lot 2 sessions ago, but I want to stress this again, because I think it's such an important and interesting point when thinking about modern day Israel. Namely that Israel and Zionism is simultaneously a natural part of Jewish tradition, and some might even view it as a concluding chapter of Jewish history. And so the story can go, we were exiled from Israel 2,000 years ago, we sort of metaphorically wandered the world, or wandering the desert, to use the words of the Torah, and all of a sudden in 1948, we came home, and this is sort of a full closing circle. And so in some ways, Zionism can be viewed as a almost happily ever after of Jewish history. On the other hand, and we discussed this again in more depth a couple sessions ago, Zionism can also be seen as a break from Jewish tradition. And that story would go, we were exiled for thousands of years, but Jewish tradition taught that the exile was a divine punishment for any number of sins that we can discuss, right? We're going to commemorate Tisha B'Av in a couple of months, which is the commemoration of the day that the temples were destroyed. And one of the things that we teach in Tisha B'Av is that the temple in Jerusalem were destroyed because of baseless hatred that people had for one another. And so that narrative would go the opposite of my first narrative. That narrative would say that for thousands of years, Jews have sat around in the exile, being extremely religiously devoted, waiting and praying and yearning to return to Israel. And finally, in the late 1800s, a bunch of secular, enlightened, I'll use the term radical Jews sat around and said, hey guys, it almost seems like this Jewish tradition is holding us back from being able to be in control of our own self-autonomy. What if we, said, thank you very much, Jewish tradition, but we've had enough of you. Let's neatly pocket that to the side, and let's actually have a human-centric return to Israel that actually challenges Jewish tradition in a lot of ways. And so we discussed again 2 weeks ago that Zionism can both be seen as a continuation of Jewish tradition and a huge break from Jewish tradition. And like most Jewish questions, it contains elements of both. So if anybody was coming here for simplistic questions of, well, is Zionism a natural part of Jewish tradition or a radical break from Jewish tradition, right? We have exactly both. And one of the reasons why I wanted to start with the Declaration of Independence is that it contains elements of both. And one of the reasons why this is such a unique text, and one of the reasons why, especially on Yom HaTzmaut, and especially once we're going to be talking about a lot of historical dates in modern day Israel, I thought it would be important to go through this document, even though I'm going to guess a lot of people here have read this before, is because it seamlessly ties in ancient Jewish values with modern Jewish values into one document. So I'll read quickly and then we can have a brief discussion. So it says, Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Just as one more tangent aside, this can also be seen as a good summary of our last 18 weeks of Jewish history to some extent. Here, their religious, spiritual, and political identity was shaped. Here, they first attained to statehood, created cultural values of national and universal significance, and gave to the world the eternal book of books. So this is obviously talking about ancient 2,000 to 3,000 year old Jewish history. After forcibly being exiled from their land, the people kept faith with it throughout their dispersion and never ceased to pray and hope for the return to it and for the restoration in it of their political freedom. Impelled by this historical and traditional attachment, Jews strove in every successive generation to reestablish themselves in their ancient homeland. In recent decades, they returned in their masses, pioneers, mapilim, immigrants coming to Eretz Yisrael in defiance of restrictive legislation, and defenders. They made the deserts bloom, revived the Hebrew language, built villages and towns, and created a thriving community controlling its own economy and culture, loving peace but knowing how to defend itself, bringing the blessing of progress to the country's inhabitants, and aspiring towards independent nationhood. In the year 1897, at the summons of the spiritual father of the Jewish state, Theodor Herzl, I'll note one irony that Theodor Herzl was anything but a spiritual person. So you can already see here some ironic language here. The first Zionist Congress convened and proclaimed the right of the Jewish people to national rebirth in its own country. I'm going to summarize some more because this is a lengthy document. They then spend a paragraph talking about the Balfour Declaration and the fact that the UN has given the mandate. They then talk about anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. They then talk about the UN vote, right? And this is all interesting just in getting to the conclusion. And then at the end, they say, or towards the end, they say, this right is the natural right of the Jewish people to be masters of their own fate, like all other nations in their sovereign state. And they declare the state of Israel. And right after they declare the state of Israel, here is how the Declaration of Independence ends. Let me make this a little smaller so I can see it all in one gap. The state of Israel will be open for Jewish immigration and for the ingathering of the exiles. It will foster the development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants. It will be based on freedom, justice, and peace as envisioned by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. It will safeguard the holy places of all religions, and it will be faithful to the principle of the charters of nations. They then go and they say, we appeal to all the surrounding countries, and here is the state of Israel. So a couple of things to note before we even hop into our main presentation today is this contains a lot of dialectics, right? A lot of Jewish tradition contains a lot of dialectics. And just to review, a dialectic is two competing ideas that are balancing itself out, not trying to defeat each other, but actually trying to coexist. Is the defense for Israel, in Zionism, based on a universality of, well, we appeal to the UN, And well, we are just using the same rights as all other peoples, right? You can certainly find that in the Declaration of Independence. Or is the right to return to Israel because of particularistic Jewish tradition? Is it because, hey, after all, this was our land. We were here for thousands of years. We produced this culture and tradition and literature. We were exiled and we've been yearning to return. Again, two very different ways to frame Zionism. Is Israel a country for, and this gets into slightly more controversial and some of the main tension points of modern Israel. Is Israel a Jewish country or a democratic country? Is it both? Is it neither? What happens when those things come into tension, right? Israel defines itself, as per the Declaration of Independence, as a Jewish democratic country. And certainly for, let's say, I'm going to throw out a number, so take this with a grain of salt, for 98% of things, you can easily coexist as a Jewish and democratic country. So sure, if instead of having, let's say, Christmas as a national holiday, you have Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot, right? I don't think anybody would be upset at that. We all understand that there are national holidays linked to religion, right? In Israel, because of the Jewish culture that's pervasive, it just so happens to be Jewish holidays as opposed to Christian holidays. But what happens when you get into points of tension? Who is eligible for citizenship? Well, there you get, again, slightly more friction and questions that Israel's had to deal with over the past, not even 75, but 175 since the beginning of the Zionist movement, years of questions, where on the one hand, as a democratic country, right, we all know democracy, right, one person, one vote. On the other hand, if Israel wants to maintain the idea of being a Jewish state, by most definitions, Israel needs to ensure that the majority of their population are Jewish. And so Israel privileges the immigration of Jews over other peoples. Now, that might not be controversial, right? I certainly don't disagree with that. Let me just say that at the outset. But I can also see somebody saying, well, hey, wait a minute, that's a little bit different than a pure democracy, right? There is a Jewish flavor to Israel that sometimes is in friction and in tension with the democratic nature. And we can discuss this a little bit more later. The next question, I think, is also an interesting one. Is the state of Israel a state that, is it a state for its own citizens, or is it a state for Jews worldwide? Now, again, most of the time, this doesn't come with any tensions, but you can imagine, I'll just give even a banal example. Should Israeli taxpayer money go to rescue missions of Jews in the diaspora? Now, most Israelis might say, yeah, of course. But again, there still are questions in tension when you have, I think the population of Israel just hit 10 million a couple of weeks ago. So you have 10 million citizens of Israel. Roughly 7 to 8 million of those citizens of Israel are Jewish. The other 2 to 3 million are either Muslim, Christian, and then other varying religions. And then you have about 8 million Jews, 8 to 9 million of Jews living elsewhere in the world. What is the relationship between diasporic Jewry and the state of Israel? Should Jews in America have a say in what happens in Israel? If Israel is, and I see some nice, right, this is always good, because right when I asked that question, I saw half of you shake your head yes, and half of you shake your head no. So I know that I'm hitting a nice issue here. If Israel, right, just work through the logic here for a second, right? I won't give any opinions here. If Israel is a state for global Jewry, then of course Jews in the diaspora should have a say over what happens in Israel. Maybe not to elect who's going to be their next prime minister and elect tax rates, but let's say politicians in Israel suggest that they want to change the right of return. Or let's say politicians in Israel are discussing who is considered a Jew for the purpose of Jewish marriage inside of Israel, right? There's no secular marriage in Israel. Should American Jews get a say? So if you think that Israel is for worldwide Jewry, and that's its primary function and concern, your answer would probably be, well, of course, American Jews should get a say. If your concern is no, the whole point of Zionism in Israel is to turn the Jewish nation state into a country like all others. So the people who live there get a vote, they can figure out what happens, great. And everybody living overseas, we can either move there or shut up, right? So those are basically the two views. Again, obviously you can have any number of points in the middle, but just even at the outset of the foundation of the country, and even just reading over the Declaration of Independence, which again in Israel serves as sort of a quasi-constitution and foundational set of values, you can already see these conflicts, right? The last one I'll say, which I think comes out as slightly obvious once you read the Declaration of Independence, but it's worth saying again, the Declaration of Independence, along with the Israeli national anthem, along with a lot of things in the Israeli public sphere, are Jewish in nature. Now, again, that might not be a problem at all, right? I'm not against the Declaration of Independence and the anthem and the currency and the language all being Jewish-centric, but what is the status or the national status of non-Jews that are living in Israel, right? And so these are all questions, right? Not necessarily dissimilar to questions that all countries that care to worry about such things have to deal with. But these are a lot of, again, the unique tension points that are popping up in modern day Israel. If anybody has any preliminary comments, let's take like 2 to 3 minutes. If anybody has any thoughts, and then we will jump into some history here. Perfect. I'm honestly a little shocked there weren't 15 different comments there, but you can feel free to interrupt me in the middle. So let's get right into the history here. So we discussed at the end of 2 sessions ago, 1948 and the Independence War and all of the aftermath there. So we're going to start today at the end of the 1948 war, where Israel has been established. Israel successfully fended off a multi-border attack from all of its neighbors. And all of a sudden in 1949, you get this map of Israel, where Israel is this blue area. You have the Gaza Strip here, which is under Egyptian control. You have the, what I'll call the West Bank here under Jordanian control. And you have Jerusalem split in two between West Jerusalem, which is in Israeli control, and East Jerusalem, which is under Jordan control. As one more just important point here, East Jerusalem is where the Western Wall is. It's where the Temple Mount and Al-Aqsa are. So East Jerusalem is really, when we think of the old city of Jerusalem, we're talking about East Jerusalem. West Jerusalem is a lot of the newer, more, fancy upscale places in Jerusalem where a lot of Americans happen to live, for anybody who's traveled through Jerusalem lately. And so this, for the first 18 years of Israel's existence, these were the borders. And we discussed 2 sessions ago, but I'll repeat it, that in a lot of ways, the modern state of Israel was built on compromise, which should be no surprise to everybody here. Anybody who's, again, I made this joke 2 weeks ago, but it's worth making again. Anybody here who's ever sat on a board for any Jewish organization, right? If you can try to get 9 people to try to figure out exactly how to run your institute, Hillel, synagogue, what have you, you can imagine the difficulty in getting 2 to 3 million people to agree on exactly what a state is going to look like. And so the only reason why Israel was able to be formed is because of a lot of political compromise made by mostly the labor Zionists, David Ben-Gurion, and a lot of people in his camp. And he compromised on a lot, right? And we talked about this two weeks ago, but right now it's worth mentioning again, because Israel is in the midst of historic political unrest, and probably the only way Israel is going to get out of it is through some sort of compromise. It's worth mentioning, right, all of the compromises early Israel went through, right? The first compromise is obvious, that this map is never what anybody in the history of Jewish history wanted Israel to look like. Now, that is not a political statement, right? So this is, again, where questions around Israel get complicated, because one could imagine Israel being, for lack of a better word, the whole thing, but politically understand the need to compromise, because there's also another peoples there, right? Today, they're known as the Palestinians, right? In 1949, probably they would not have been called the Palestinians, although that is up for debate exactly when Palestinian identity started to foment. But no Jew throughout the history of Jewish history envisioned Israel being Tel Aviv and Haifa and Beersheba, right? And if you need any proof of that, right, we open the Torah, which we read through every week, and the stories that feature most centrally in the Torah are all of the cities that are in the modern day West Bank, right? Shechem, Hebron, right? All of these extreme, right? Jerusalem, right? All of these important cities, right? These are the cities of Jewish history, right? And so already this map is a huge compromise by the sort of wider Zionist camp. Now, of course, not all Zionists were happy with this compromise, right? We discussed several weeks ago that there were multiple competing factions of Zionists, most importantly, and namely the revisionist Zionists, led by initially Zev Jabotinsky and eventually Menachem Begin, that dreamed of what we'll call Greater Israel. But already from the outset, massive compromises were made, even to ensure the existence of the country. Here we have a nice picture of Ben Gurion, right, who again really spearheaded this entire endeavor. And so we look at what Israel was like in 1949 to 1967, and we realize that the first 10 or so years of the country were amidst major turmoil, right? And what I mean by major turmoil, right, is that, think about it, 1948 or 1949 is only a few years post-Holocaust. The entire Jewish world was in unrest, right? The Jews in America were just finding out, right? We discussed American history last week. They were just starting to realize the full extent of what had happened in Europe. And the community was horrified. They were horrified at what went on politically. They were horrified at an American government that failed to intervene. They were horrified at their own Jewish organizational leaders who they viewed as not doing enough. There were tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees in 1945, 1946, 1947 that were ending up in DP, displaced persons camp, all over the world. And so Israel, right, led by this Mapai labor socialist government, which really led for the first 30 years, we'll discuss this a little bit more later, right, took on this extreme conditions of the first 10 years of the state. And it starts off right after the state was formed. One of the most notable pieces of legislation was passed was this idea of the right of return that immediately saw an influx of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Holocaust survivors coming into the country. And in the first 3 years of Israel's existence, the population of Israel doubled, right? And if we think about a new country just starting out, right, it still doesn't have institutions that are well built up. They're still trying to figure out exactly what a government looked like. Again, we haven't had a Jewish government since the Maccabees, right? So this is very much a new trial run. And all of a sudden, you don't have, you know, a nice, calm 20, 30 years in order to figure out exactly how to set the mechanisms of government into place. You have a massive war in 1948, and the second the war is over, you have millions of Jews, right, Jewish refugees that need a place. And of course, you're going to let them all in, right? Not to mention, throughout this period, life for Mizrahi Jews, right, Jews that lived in the Arab world, were getting increasingly persecuted, often as a result of Israel, even though, and this is important to mention, we'll go to this a little bit more later, many of them were apathetic to Zionism, right? Many Jews, let's just say Egypt, many Egyptian Jews, if you would have gone into one of their synagogues in the year 1950 and polled your average Egyptian Jew and said, do you want to move to Israel? Or are you a Zionist? The answer you would probably have received from the most amount of people was, no, don't bother me, we're happy here, right? And all of a sudden, over the next decade or two, certainly by 1967, that takes a major shift. And in this, again, this formative 18 to 20 years of the beginning of Israel before 1967, life for Jews throughout the Arab world got consistently worse, right, since the 1940s. And you also have a major influx of Mizrahi Jews. And so again, you can imagine all of this turmoil that was happening. And the Israeli institutions and the economy had to now absorb millions of refugees, often coming in without any funds, without any, right, ability to work, right, under, of course, no fault of their own. But this is tough for a country, even in the best of times. This is right after Israel was founded and just fought a war for its survival. And so just to go over and just to give names to a couple of these rescue operations of Mizrahi Jews, because one of the fascinating stories, and again, if we had, you know, a whole session to go through just some of these stories, right, as we say in the Passover Seder, Dayenu, right, that would be enough for a whole class. but here it'll just be one line in this wider PowerPoint. Israel underwent several rescue missions to rescue Jews that were living throughout the Arab world, right? So some of the more notable ones, right? Magic Carpet, Ezra and Nehemiah, and right, there are several more where Jews from, right? The first one's Yemen, the second one is Iraq and Iran area, right? Jews that were, again, airlifted to Israel because they were under threat, right? Again, nodding to Israel's mission of not just worrying about Jews living in Israel, but worrying about Jews all over the place. Now, this gets difficult, right? For anybody who thought this was a nice, simple story, this gets difficult because when they got to Israel, a lot of them were treated badly. And this is, again, one of the more painful legacies of Zionism and of Israel, is the way that a lot of Mizrahi Jews were treated once they got into the country. Now, there are a couple of quote unquote reasons for this. When I say reasons, I'm not saying good defenses for this. I'm saying historical and sociological reasons why this happened, right? One, we could just blame the whole thing on racism, right? As some academics want to do. The reason why I'm hesitant to do that, and if anybody here has differing thoughts, I would love to hear it, is because I think that especially modern day Americans have a negative, I'm trying to think of a better word, but have a distorting tendency to try to see Israel through the eyes of America. And so whenever you see differences between different groups in America, you immediately, right, because of the legacy of a lot of things in America, everybody says, well, that's of course racism. Therefore, if a similar phenomenon is happening in Israel, right, we should say that's also all racism, right? I don't want to discount that, right? I'm sure that there certainly was a lot of anti-Mizrahi racism in the year 1950, 1951, 1952, but there were also a lot of other conditions on the ground, right? Perhaps one of the most important ones was a lot of Mizrahi Jews coming into Israel were still deeply traditionally religious. Now, we discussed Zionism several weeks ago, and one of the main fundaments of the vast majority of the Zionist movement, and it didn't make a difference if this was the labor Zionists who were atheist socialists or the revisionist Zionists who were also tended to be atheist anti-socialists, right? This is before any notable religious Zionist population, that a lot of the early Zionists just viewed religion as bad and as basically holding Jews back throughout history. One of the things that the Zionist movement attempted to do is recreate Jews, not in a religious image, but in a nationalistic image. And there was very little room for religion in Israel in the year 1950, 1951, 1952. And all of a sudden you have these people coming in from Morocco and Egypt and Yemen and Iraq and Syria, right? We can obviously recount many more countries. And they brought with them very devout religious beliefs. And ideologically, they were a lot more similar to the ultra-Orthodox Jews, of which there were few, but again, a sizable population in Israel at the time, who most Zionists viewed disparagingly. And so this is just another sociological reason. Again, giving sociological reasons as to why these things happen is not a defense, but there was a mixture of racism, a mixture of looking down on them because of religion. And one of the things that happened, and again, this is one of the darker legacies, is that they were given housing in less desirable neighborhoods. There were certain cities that were known as Ashkenazi cities, right? Especially a lot of the kibbutzim. There were certain jobs that Mizrahi Jews were not allowed to have to do, but everybody knew that, oh, you wouldn't get this job if you were not an Ashkenazi Jew. And this eventually comes to a major boiling point in the 1970s, which is why I'm going into this now. But this is also one of the legacies of Israel, and it is worth mentioning here. And then you get to one of the most interesting debates, both for its historical importance and also because it is a truly fascinating and difficult ethical question, which is in the year 1952, Germany offered reparations in the form of tens of billions of dollars, which 70 years ago was a lot more than it is today, for the Holocaust. And you had a debate that really tore Israel in half in terms of how to think of this. And we can probably, if we sat here for even the next 2 minutes, we can probably all come up with all of the good reasons that both sides came, right? I'll just mention some of the obvious ones. The pro-accepting reparations side, right? And just one more important thing, Germany was going to pay these reparations in a lump sum to Israel, the state of Israel, not necessarily trying to go to individual families that were affected in the Holocaust, but actually to the state as a whole. And so, right, already this wasn't the type of reparations that they try to find every single family that lived in Hungary, Poland, Germany, right, all of these areas that we spoke about several weeks ago. And so on the pro-accepting reparations side, the arguments are fairly straightforward. It was the Holocaust happened. Us accepting reparations is not letting Germany off the hook, but it's us moving on in some deep sense from the Holocaust and us acknowledging that what's important is not to look backwards, but to look forwards. And what is happening looking forward is we have a new country now. Our population just doubled. Our economy is going to crash. And this would basically help us jumpstart our country in a way that would immediately bolster the lives of millions of Jews, right? That is the let's accept reparations side. And on the anti-reparation side, right, you could imagine the argument is saying, how dare you say we're going to accept reparations from Germany? Look at what they did, right? Us accepting reparations is going to seem like we are saying, yes, we accept your apology. The whole point of Zionism and the state of Israel is we don't need anything from anybody. We are strong. We have an army, right? To some extent, who cares, right? We don't need your money. We don't need your, to some extent, your blood money from Germany, right? Get out of here. We're going to do things our own way. And one of the interesting things about this debate, and I'll say in a second who was on each side of the debate, but these are two different, to some extent, ideological models of Israel that are coming to play here. We have one version of Israel that's attempting to be more of a global entity and saying we have to interact with other countries, we have to play real politics to some extent, right? These are the conditions on the ground, let's be more pragmatic. And another side that to some extent was being a lot more ideological, right? Not necessarily in a good or bad way, but a side that was coming in a little more hardline and saying, we don't need anything from anybody. What good has listening, paying attention, worrying about, accepting things from, excuse my crude term for a second, but the goyim, right? The rest of the world. Let's be in charge of ourselves now, right? Who needs them, right? And it's probably of no surprise that the people that were in charge of that were on the side of accepting reparations were Mapai, which is Ben-Gurion, the labor Zionists, right? The socialists. And the character in Israel that spearheaded the anti-reparations campaign was none other than Menachem Begin, who, just a brief review of Menachem Begin, because he ends up being one of Israel's most important figures in history. He was a revisionist Zionist, a student of Zev Jabotinsky. He was one of the leaders of Etzel, or the Irgun, which was the militia that was founded with the split that broke off from the precursor to the IDF, with the explicit premise and mission to try to be a little bit more proactive and aggressive at both pushing the British out of British Mandate Palestine and also reprisal attacks on the local Arab population. And so Menachem Begin spearheads the campaign of anti-reparations. And this is also, to some extent, the beginning of Menachem Begin's popularity as a national figure. It's going to be about 20 years until he actually gains any political power based off of this. But this was seen, again, as a major turning point in Israel. At the end, of course, Israel accepts the reparations. It probably, right, I'm not an economist, but it probably helped, right, for lack of a stronger word. But this debate, again, just goes down as one of the earlier ideological debates to determine really the point and the ideological turn of Israel. Just one more or two more bullet points here, and then we'll take pause for questions. In 1956, and I'm only mentioning this here for one explicit reason, because we don't really have time to get into every small war and skirmish. Israel is convinced by France and England to join into a war with the explicit intent at opening the Suez Canal. And the reason why this is so important, right? This ended up being not such an important war. I mean, Israel's had a lot more very important wars, to the point where a lot of people even forget the Sinai campaign as a war. But this shows the start, right? And this is going to be a major trend in Israel until, probably 100 years from now, about Israel being important, not just because of the state of Israel and Jews and even the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but Israel being an important country because of global geopolitics. And there are a couple of ways to think about this, right? We can think of this geographically or ideologically. Let me just give the case for both. The case geographically is, I probably should have brought a map for this point, but I didn't realize I was going to make it, is that if you look at where Israel is on a world map, it is right at the crossroads of Africa, Asia, and Europe. And so, right, this is also one of the reasons why in the ancient world, the land of Israel was so coveted by the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Persians and the Greeks and the Romans, right? You can go down the list there. The reason why Israel was such an important landmass is because it was the one land bridge between these three major continents. And so geography has stayed the same over the past 3,000 years. And lo and behold, Israel today is still an extremely important place for, let's say, military bases, or allowing ships to get through so they don't have to go all the way down under Africa. And so Israel oftentimes gets dragged into a lot of wider global geopolitical conflicts, not because the Israeli government or even most Israelis or most Jews in the world are sitting there saying, gee, it would be great if our newfound country, after 8 years of existing, randomly went into war and attacked Egypt and upset America and upset the Soviet Union, as is what happened. But Israel oftentimes, again, gets pulled into a lot of these wider conflicts, right? So that's the geographical case. The ideological case is similar, right? Israel is a unique country for where it's at in the world, right? Israel is obviously a small country that is not Muslim in the midst of a lot of countries that are Muslim. And so already there is a different religion governing the wider area. But especially after the 1960s, Israel is a liberal country to some extent. When I say liberal, I'm using uppercase liberal, by which I mean it is not communist, right? Even though it started off much more socialist and communist, and even to some extent aligned with the Soviet Union. A lot of Mapai members of Knesset were actually more aligned with the Soviet Union than America in the beginning, but that took a very quick pivot once the Soviet Union became increasingly anti-Semitic. And so Israel started becoming the one Western democracy among a whole region of Soviet-backed countries. And to some extent, that's still a little bit true today, right? One of the reasons why America, right? There are a lot of reasons why today America is so invested, both financially, culturally, militarily, politically, in ensuring Israel's not just existence, but its thriving, is because of this wider regional ideological battle that America wants liberal democracy to have a foothold in the Middle East. So again, these are just two different reasons why the Sinai campaign was important. The exact aftermath, again, Israel was strongly censored from the US, and the Sinai campaign was largely a failure. But again, this is the first of many times, and times that will probably, right, I'm not a fortune teller, but I would place a lot of money on this, continue, that Israel gets dragged into these wider socio-political conflicts. And then just one more bullet point for the pre-67, and then we'll take some time for questions here, is in 1961, we get the Eichmann trial. And just a brief couple words on that. The Eichmann was captured by the Mossad. So one of the things that was happening in the 1950s, and I think I mentioned this book a couple weeks ago, but there's a book called Rise and Kill First that was written by an Israeli journalist named Ronen Bergman. And it is one, I have a bad habit of reading too many books about Israel. This is definitely the most fascinating and interesting and coolest in terms of the scenarios that he's describing. And he basically documents early Mossad activity. And in the 1950s, some of the things that the Mossad was doing to try to go around the world and capture Nazis is absolutely fascinating. I mean, even movies probably can't live up to exactly what happened. And so they capture Eichmann. And again, this is not just important because one person was captured, but this is, again, to a large extent, what broadcasted the Holocaust into an international audience. And this ends up being important for Israel for a very specific reason. Namely, from 1948 to the early 1960s, just like the early Zionist movement wanted to separate themselves from the religious Jew, early Zionists also wanted to separate themselves from what they viewed as the, I'll use another crude term, right? The sad and the weak exilic Jew, right? Because again, the whole point of this type of Zionism was to say, Jews in exile are those weak Jews that couldn't defend themselves. We are now the strong new Jew. We have an army. We would never let something like that happen to us. And again, this is obviously not normative. This is descriptive. And, some of the most interesting and moving accounts, Amos Oz, right, who was living in Jerusalem in the 1950s, writes beautifully about this, is that to be a Holocaust survivor in Israel in the 1950s, it was not seen right today, and for the last 50 years of Jewish life around the world, if somebody's a Holocaust survivor, that's like, a Torah walks into a room in the sense of, right, you stand up, you show the utmost respect, right, anything they need, right, everybody's crowded around to hear every word of what they're saying, right, they're treated as holy people, right, for good reason. What Amos Oz writes about Israel in the 1950s is that it was the exact opposite. It was not a badge of honor, it was a badge of disgrace. And even when Israel and early Zionists talked about, or not early Zionists, but early Zionists in the state of Israel talked about the Holocaust, they only wanted to talk about the parts that made Jews seem strong. So the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And even to some extent, the day for Holocaust Memorial Day in Israel is not Yom HaShoah, right? We tend to think of it as Yom HaShoah. It's actually Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura, right? The day of Holocaust remembrance and strength, right? And specifically, the things that are commemorated are things like the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Now, again, I'm not giving a value judgment. I understand why there was a need to do that. But one of the reasons, again, from a Jewish historical and just sociological standpoint, that Eichmann trials was so important is this is the beginning of the shift, where even a lot of the most machismo Zionists, hard-headed, we would never let something like that happen to us, right? We are strong in Israel, began to realize, okay, we were for lack of a stronger word, we were misjudging this, right? We actually really do need to give the Holocaust the respect and honor that it deserves. So again, we have made it through, I think, 13 years of the state of Israel, and a lot is happening. Let's just take a minute or two. I would love to hear questions, comments, thoughts, anything like that. Go for it, Susan.
Sorry about the muting.
Very good.
When you were talking about the not honoring Holocaust survivors, that may explain why when friends of ours, he was a university professor who took a sabbatical to Israel, probably in the early to mid 50s, and they were Americans, but they knew Yiddish, and they were looked at, when they came back, they felt looked down upon because they wanted to speak Yiddish because they didn't know Hebrew. And so that might then, all these years later, explain to me why they were looked down upon, why particularly the wife felt ostracized.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that comment. And you're exactly right. And Yiddish even plays into this. To some extent, there was ever since Eliezer ben Yehuda, I don't remember if we talked about him, right? He was he's not just the person that a lot of important streets were named after. He also reinvented the language of Hebrew. One of his legacies is, of course, reinventing Hebrew, but also this incredible battle of languages that transpired between Hebrew and Yiddish, to the extent where speaking Yiddish, even still today in the Jewish community, if people try to, let's say, learn Yiddish, it wouldn't be common to say, why are you bothering learning Yiddish? Learn Hebrew. Right, with the subtext, exactly what you were saying, Susan, and exactly what we're talking about, right? Real strong modern Jews learn Hebrew. Yiddish is what those exilic, maybe the Haredim and the Hasidic Jews, right? They learn Yiddish because they're still living in the 1800s. But real moderate, I'm being a little bit tongue in cheek, real modern Jews, right? We speak Hebrew. So exactly. Ruth, go for it.
Daniel.
Hello.
Oh, go for it, Susan.
All right, I have three things to say.
Oh.
First of all, wasn't it Salo Baron who talks about the lachrymose study of history, crying all the time? And I think it was Salo Baron.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is that the young Israelis called the survivors the vus because they would go vus. And yet there still is a very heavy, or there used to be a very heavy Ashkenazic presence, over the Mizrahi Jews. That was like the preferred, I would say preferred Judaism. So that's all I wanted to say.
Yeah. Thank you, Ruth. And and I think that's from actually Amos Oz, or I mean, I'm sure it's from other things, but he talks about this. Bilal, go for it.
Hello.
Hey, how's it going?
Well, thank you for asking. So I'm, this is my first time attending, and I'm picking up, I think, at a really good spot. And I'm curious about, can you hear me? I'm on the headphones. Okay, so I'm curious because we have the Ashkenazi Jews who came after the Balfour Declaration, and I'm trying to understand, like exactly. You said the population doubled in 1948. Now you said that was attributed mainly to the Mizrahi Jews, right? Mizrahi. Mizrahi. Yeah. I'm sorry. I should say it with the accent. Mizrahi Jews, and I'm trying to understand now with respect to the population. What was the population? And this is probably something I could have Googled, but I'd rather prefer hear it from you. But the population density, what was it like as far as the population from 1988 to 1940, from 1918 to 1948?
Oh, it's a great question. So the population of Israel in 1948 was around 800,000. By 1952, It got to 1.5 million, 1.6 million. I think the population was, I might be wrong. So again, I'm happy you trust me more than Google, but maybe that's a mistake. I want to say it was about 400 or 500,000 right after the Balfour. And just one other point of maybe I misspoke. It wasn't mainly Mizrahi Jews. It was actually mainly Holocaust survivors, but with several other hundreds of thousands of Mizrahi Jews. And so the population was, it was probably about two to one, right? 2 being Ashkenazi Jews to every 1 Mizrahi Jew who ended up coming in. Okay,
and then as far as this, we have these distinctions between the 2 separate bodies of Jews. Now I heard that obviously one body of Jews spoke a completely different language than the other body of Jews, and they migrated into this one language. So as far as this civil rights movement, it seems like there was a serious issue with prejudicial narratives, as far as with respect to understanding what these well, I would like to say Middle Eastern Jews, more or less, rather than European Jews. So is it something that was predominant mainly in a specific time period, and have they overcame these obstacles in recent years?
Oh, it's a really great question. So it ends up happening in the 1970s, which is the real protest movement that happens. The short answer is things are a lot better in 2023 in Israel with Ashkenazi and Mizrahi, still not 100%, but we'll get to it in 3 or 4 slides. So I'll hold your question. No, go, but it's a really great question. Elaine, go for it.
Well, I can only tell you the stories that Chaim told me when he arrived to Israel in 1947, and what it was like for him coming from a country that was Bulgarian, which was, the Bulgarian Jews were saved, but in essence, they also faced a lot of the same issues that other European Jews had to deal with. They passed all the laws, but Bulgaria proper did not send its Jews to the camps, but all the other laws were passed. So when he got to then Palestine in 1947, he said, when he went to high school, he was at a agricultural school called Mikveh Israel. And the pressure was to forget the Europe, to forget the diaspora experience, in essence. You are now a new Jew. And he said the first time he ever ate on Yom Kippur was when he arrived to Israel. To that extent, they had to create this new Jew in order to create a new country. Years later, it's very interesting because I went to go visit a youth village and many Ethiopian Jews were there. And it's very interesting. The issue with the Ethiopian Jews is that they haven't tried to completely wipe out their identity or their customs, realizing that it will take a few generations to have them transition. But I think Israel learned a lesson with that, but it was a different time and the needs were different. And the pressure was they had to create this new Jew in order to fulfill the vision of a new country.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Elaine. Yeah, and even to some extent, right? You can still see this in Israel, by the way, right? The public school curriculum, right? Let's just use an interesting example, right? If we're talking about this actually right before class on Zoom, so this will be a callback to right before the class started. If you go to a traditional yeshiva for most of Jewish history, and even now, what you're learning most of the day is rabbinic literature, right? Talmud, Midrash, rabbinic commentary, medieval commentary, halacha, Shulchan Aruch, right? But of course, all of that literature was produced in the diaspora, right? And we discussed this a lot in over the course of this trek through Jewish history about, Babylonia being a Jewish center, and then Spain being a Jewish center, and then Poland, right? All of these, right? We don't have to rehearse it. The only Jewish literature to some extent that was written in Israel is most of the Tanakh, right? And so most of the early Israeli curriculum was studying Tanakh, right? The Hebrew Bible, which again, right, to get to Elaine's point, right? That was an explicit nod to the fact that the rabbinic exilic tradition from one view was a mistake, right? Another way to say this was the only reason why we had a Talmud was because of exile and we had to react to exile. But really the ideal way that Judaism was to be practiced was much more Tanakh centric. And right, again, it's obviously not a binary, right? I'm not saying that, all, Zionists in 1950 were only studying Tanakh and all, Haredi Jews were only studying Talmud, right? Of course, history is not that simple, but through all of these things, there really was a concerted effort. And I also see Mark wrote in the chats that he has cousins in Israel that changed their name from overly Europeanized names to much more biblical Hebraic names, which of course happened hundreds and hundreds of times. And then just to read one more comment and then we'll go on. Emma wrote that Ashkenazi Jews historically spoke Yiddish, and Mizrahi Jews spoke a mixture of Arabic and Hebrew. Sephardic Jews spoke Ladino and Spanish, and Hebrew was basically trying to come up with a new language that I guess to some extent, this is my own commentary, not Emma's comment anymore, that was trying to come up with to some extent, new universal Jewish language. And so all past Jewish identities were trying to be wiped out. Now, whether we view this as good or bad, right, that's a different question, right? That's a historical, ethical question. But it is true that early Israel tried to wipe out all Jewish identities that existed before Zionism, for better or worse, right? So now, to some extent, in early Israel, they didn't even want to view it as religious, secular, Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Mizrahi. They wanted to view everybody as Israeli. Now, obviously, that doesn't work, right? And one of the interesting subtexts here, and I'll say this, and then hopefully this won't get us into a huge tangent, given that most of the early Zionists were socialists, one of the things we know about socialism is it also tries to whitewash all characteristics of identity in the service of this bigger mission. And so, right, to some extent, Zionism tried to do something similar, is to say, we are all in for the state, right? All in for this new ideological mission. It doesn't matter what happened before, right? That's obviously not how humans think. So it didn't work, right? But that to some extent was the foundational ethos. And even if you think about the kibbutz movement, I mean, the kibbutz movement are a lot of times touted as the only time socialism might have actually been successful, albeit it was smaller areas, but it probably is not an overstatement to say that if it wasn't for the socialism of Zionism in the 1950s, the state of Israel might never have gotten off the ground, right? To some extent, they needed that communal spirit where there was no set, right? Zev Jabotinsky, who was, again, the founder of revisionist Zionism, he wasn't even that big of a fan of socialism, but he would still be more of a socialist than probably all of us today, right? He wrote a famous essay where he basically says, if we need anything, we have to fill the place. And he gives us this metaphor for, if we need a wheel, I will be the wheel. If we need a toe, I will be the toe. And he basically, describes this and basically saying there is no individualistic identity. There is only the fostering of this communal spirit, right? Israel, obviously, right, that is not what Israel looks like now, but that was to some extent some of the foundational ethos. And I think all the comments we heard, both in the chat and out loud, sort of highlighted that. Okay, we're only 13 years in, and we only have about 30 minutes left. So we're going to go a little faster now, although I think that was a fascinating conversation. So throughout this time, right, this is an intro to the next bit. One of the things that happens early on in Israel that's, again, going to be no surprise to everybody here is all of the surrounding Arab countries are obviously not fans of the newly founded state of Israel. And we can, again, you could probably have a whole class on that statement and why and all of that. But ever since the 1948 war and Israeli independence, there was a building up animosity throughout the Arab world, which at this time was sort of led by Egypt. And this is still in the stages of Arab nationalism, right? The Arab world went through a number of phases of identity, for lack of a better word. And from about 1920 to the Six-Day War, or even to the 70s, there was a sense of united Arab nationalism, which one of its main fundaments was being against Israel. And so all of a sudden in the late to mid 1960s, you start to get increasingly fierce calls of, we are going to wipe out Israel. And the sort of early days and building up to the 1967, or what eventually becomes the Six-Day War, are happening. And this is something that, again, Jews, both in Israel and all across the world, are terrified. And you have Jews, both in America and Israel, talking about potentially a second Holocaust and talking about the fact that Israel might be destroyed. And you have, politicians, Egyptian and Syrian and Lebanese politicians going on their state-sponsored radio saying, we are going to take no prisoners, right? Anybody who has read anything about the Six-Day War can understand the ferociousness of the buildup. And again, sadly, we don't have half an hour to talk about exactly what happened during the war. But in a very long story short, right, Israel is attacked from all sides, and not just and this is all on the left here, right? It's not just from the four countries that border it, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, but also Iraq sends some troops and Morocco sends some troops, and you really get a united Arab front against Israel. And one of the reasons why, there are a lot of reasons why this war was terrifying, but one thing that I think a casual observer of Israel might not realize, but something that plays into even today the politics of the region, is there are three maps here. I'm going to try to explain this. This map is a topographical map. Is a topographical map where the darker the color, the more mountainous the region is. And so what this map tells us is this area in the middle, known either as Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, Palestine, whatever people want to call it today, this area is extremely mountainous, whereas the coastal plains are very flat, right? And so basic war strategy, right? The higher areas you have, the better, right? They're good for surveillance. It's obviously easier to fend off an enemy if you're on top of a hill and they're on the bottom. right? So this area is very strategic, and this area, the coastal plain, is very unstrategic. Well, that's inconvenient for Israel because this is a map of population density from 1948 to 1967, where the darker the color, the higher the population is in any given area. And you see over here, right, the Tel Aviv area is the densest part of Israel. So to go back to this original map, you have about a 20-mile stretch here where the vast majority of the population lives, that's flat, surrounded by mountains. And all of a sudden you're about to be attacked, right? This is important because after the 6-Day War and Israel takes over what we now call Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, Palestine, whatever term people want to use, this is one of the main reasons why militarily Israel has not wanted to give that land up or give it back, right? So Israel obviously wins this war, and the map of Israel turns from this in the blue to this in the blue. And so the map of Israel triples in size in terms of the geography of the land. Most notably, right, there's 4 important things that happened geographically as a result of the 6-Day War. Israel conquered the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. Israel conquers the West Bank from Jordan. Israel conquers the Golan Heights from Syria. The Golan Heights, just as a brief tangent aside, I don't think we're going to get to talk about it again, but the Golan Heights is also extremely mountainous, right? Actually, the highest point in Israel, Mount Hermon, is in the Golan Heights, and it also is important for water because it's who controls the Kinneret, right? And water is obviously also a major tension point in the Middle East. And Israel takes back control of Eastern Jerusalem. This is, of course, the iconic famous picture of the paratroopers looking up at the Western Wall. And this creates the scenario that Israel has been in for the last 50-something years, right? I didn't do the math. And a lot of, one Israeli thinker, I'm forgetting the name, summed it up as the last 50 years, Israel has been in the 7th day of the 6-Day War. Because the ramifications of this war are so important that it basically dictates everything, not everything, but if there's one war in which somebody should learn about to understand the nuances of modern day Israel, it's this war. Because Israel goes from being on its, to some extent, at least as a lot of people viewed it, its deathbed, to coming out as the strongest army by far in the entirety of the Middle East. I mean, Israel won this war in 6 days, right? That is crazy, right? If we just think about this from a military point of view, and for those interested in the military side, right, there are plenty of really interesting military strategy books written based off of the 6-Day War here. And so the euphoria all across not just Israel, but the Jewish world was palpable after this. And this is also, right, we spoke about American Jewish history 2 times ago, but it's worth mentioning that from 1948 to 1967, in the American Jewish community, many people were Zionists, but they weren't wear it on your sleeve Zionists. They were, if you ask them, do you support Israel? They would have said yes, but trying to be sort of very quiet about it. All of a sudden, after the 6-Day War, there was such an emotional roller coaster of, again, I'm going to use very crude terms here. We're all going to die to, oh my goodness, not just are we the strongest, people in the region, we've also reconquered and freed the Western Wall and the Temple Mount and all of these historic cities, right? Hebron, Shechem, all of these places that we read about, that there was such a euphoria and such a, right, high level of identification with Israel. And this is actually from just an American point of view, you start to see a lot of American Jewish organizations start to become even more Israel-centric. From an Israel point of view, this is, of course, a lot more important because you're now faced with a lot of very important questions once you conquer all this land. Namely, what do you do with the land? 2, what do you do with the people in the land? And these are questions that Israel has still been thinking about over the last 50-something years. I'm going to skip the Sinai because we're actually going to talk about the Sinai in a couple of slides. The sneak peek version is Israel ends up later on trading the Sinai back to Egypt in exchange for peace. So the Sinai ends up not being such a big deal. I'm going to take this from easiest to hardest. The Golan Heights, Israel annexes, And the reason why the word annex is important here is because when Israel annexes the Golan Heights, they offer citizenship to everybody who was living in the Golan Heights. And so post 1967, the Golan Heights officially became a part of Israel proper. And everybody that was living in the Golan Heights between 1948 and 1967 that were still there after the war, obviously a lot of Syrians ended up fleeing to Syria in the midst of the war, they ended up becoming Israeli citizens. So most notably, there's a large Druze population, which is a religious ethnic group that lives in southern Syria and the Golan Heights. The West Bank, now you have a whole host of other issues that Israel was worried about. Namely, the West Bank was crucial for security of Israel. And so Israel did not want to pull out, and still, right, arguably, a lot of politicians in Israel do not want to pull out of the West Bank at all because it's viewed as a crucial part of Israeli security. On the other hand, right, and here's where you get to probably the most complex internal political issue that Israel has ever had and still has, there were, according to some estimates, 800,000, 900,000, right? Today, it's up to 2 to 3 million people living in the West Bank who Israel did not want to annex because Israel did not want to offer citizenship. Because if you offer 1 million or 2 million or 3 million people citizenship in a democratic country, all of a sudden that country might not be a Jewish country anymore. Because what happens if the majority of people vote for it to stop being a Jewish country? So you can sort of follow the logic here that Israel didn't want to say, okay, we're pulling out of the West Bank, you can have it back, Jordan, because Israel knew that it would just be attacked again and it would be catastrophic. And actually, according to most military historians, 6 years later, Israel is attacked again in 1973 Yom Kippur War. And if Israel had returned the West Bank after 67, Israel probably would have been destroyed in the Yom Kippur War, right? This isn't me, pontificating. This is a lot of military historians. So from a military point of view, it was extremely important that Israel not return the West Bank. From a citizenship and democratic point of view, the problem is on the other side. Namely, you are now in control of millions of people who you are not offering citizenship. You're in control of land that you're not formally annexing and having a part of your country, but yet you don't want to leave it for military reasons. And so Israel, right, this is not news to anybody here, takes the position of not making a decision. And Israel says, okay, we're going to keep the West Bank under military control. We're not going to have it under civic control necessarily. And we're going to just sort of ride the status quo, right? We'll discuss this a little bit later in probably 10, 15 minutes with Oslo, right? That the status quo ends up changing a lot, but we're going to basically take the middle road. And to some extent, this is still the situation Israel is involved in. Probably the best elucidation of this issue from a ethics and military and historical point of view is Micha Goodman, who has become one of the most important philosophers of modern day Israel. And he wrote a book called Catch 67 about this sort of paradox that Israel's in. And he writes as follows. He says, the right, meaning the right wing, is correct that a withdrawal from the West Bank would endanger Israel due to the physical threat. The left is correct that a continued presence in the territories would endanger Israel in terms of its ability to remain a democracy. The problem is that since everybody is correct, everybody is also incorrect. And the state of Israel is trapped in an impossible bind. And so Micha Goodman does a good job at sort of giving voice to this situation that Israel is still in to some extent, which is, what do you do, right? You can't pull out for security reasons. You don't want to offer citizenship for preserving Jewish democratic reasons, but you don't want to keep the status quo for ethical reasons. And the reason why 67 is so important for all of these reasons, historically, geographic, is that this creates the two major camps of Israeli politics that will exist until now, which is right after 1967, you get two different camps in Israel, right? What we call today the modern right and left. Today, for a variety of reasons, the Israeli left no longer really exists. We can discuss why in a little bit, but the left's point of view is we have to get out, right? This is immoral what is happening here. Israel needs to pull out of the West Bank, or Israel needs to offer citizenship to everybody there. But since Israel's never going to offer citizenship, Israel needs to pull out. Whereas the right wing in Israel says, Israel won this war, right? This was a defensive war. We need to stay here for military purposes. Let's not worry so much about the people there, right? Obviously, if you get further right, it's let's buy them off to leave, or, if you get to the furthest right, it's let's actually forcibly start to push out, right? But this ends up creating, again, the strong right-left divide that's existed right throughout the last 50 plus years of Israel, which is the reason why, again, 1967 ends up being probably the most important war in Israel's history. One more thing about the ramifications of this war, and then again, we'll take a couple of minutes. Maybe today we'll end at 7:15. So if anybody is worried about the time here, I'll buy us another 15 minutes. And if anybody has to leave at 7, I can send you the last 15 minutes for recording. There's a fourth category that happened here, which is to some extent even more confusing and difficult than the West Bank, is East Jerusalem. Because what happens in East Jerusalem is Israel doesn't formally annex it, at least right away, but Israel takes East Jerusalem into its geographical territory. Israel then later on, a couple of years later, offers citizenship to the Palestinians that are living in East Jerusalem. The majority turn it down because they view the whole thing as unfair and illegal / unethical. And so today in East Jerusalem, there are Palestinians that are under Israeli civil control, but are not citizens of the state. And so because they did not accept citizenship. And so you have now also, I think the numbers today, right, I could be wrong if somebody wants to Google fact check me, about 300,000 to 400,000 East Jerusalem Palestinians that are also right now living in Jerusalem, that again, they don't have the same status of the 20% of the population of Israel who are Israeli Arabs, who are also called Palestinian. They don't have the same status as Palestinians living in the West Bank that are under no assumption of citizenship. They are sort of in this limbo position of you're under Israeli civil and military control, but you're not full citizens. Because again, right, the legacy of that is a lot more convoluted than we have time to get into, right? If anybody has specific questions, I'm happy to address it. But the reason why I bring this up, one, is because of the incredibly difficult ethical and historical situations that this ends up arising, both in 1967 and also today in 2023, and also just in terms of the nuances that one needs to have to discuss what has become known as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in a robust way. When somebody today in 2023 says Palestinian and is talking about a certain political disposition, there are 4 different political definitions of what it might mean to be a Palestinian in modern Israel. That one, they could be a citizen of Israel, right? So let's say there are Palestinians living, let's say the city of Yaffo or Jaffa, right? That is a town that is in Israel. There are a lot of Arabs there. Many of them identify as Palestinians. They are equal citizens in a democratic country of Israel. Obviously, if you went to the ground and did polling, they would say that there is systemic racism against them, right? Same way that any minority in any country might, but all things equal, right? They are living under a democracy, equal rights. You then have East Jerusalem Palestinians that are in this limbo position I talked about before. You then have Palestinians that are living in the West Bank, who are under Israeli military control, but not civil control. And then you have, what we can call the Palestinian diaspora, which is Palestinians that are not citizens of Israel, East Jerusalem, or the West Bank, but left in either 1948 or 1967 and are living anywhere from Jordan or Egypt, even to Europe and America. And so even just the political and historical background to talk about all of these different groups is important. But again, this is all because of the legacy of the 6-Day War. And one more just important legacy point here, and then again, of course, I will pause for any and all questions and comments, is, I don't know why this all popped up, you then get the settlement project, which just to actually go back to this for a second, introducing, I didn't realize all the information was going to pop up, so I don't want to scare everybody. One of the things that begins to happen as a result of the 6-Day War, and this actually ends up growing a lot more after 73, but the seeds were planted after 67, is you start to get the growth of what we now think of as the religious Zionist camp. And so again, just to give a little bit more background, from 48 to 67, religious Zionists had fairly little political power and cultural prominence, right? Usually from 1948 to 1967, if somebody was religious, you could probably assume they were not a Zionist. And if somebody was a Zionist, you could probably assume they were not religious. And there were a couple notable exceptions, right? We talked about, right, Abraham Isaac Kook, right, Rav Kook last time, right? There were obviously a couple of yeshivot, right, traditional Jewish seminaries that were Zionist and religious at the same time. But as a result of 67, this awakens a generation to some extent of people saying, hey, wait a minute, it actually seems like we are now in control of Jerusalem. We're in control of the Temple Mount. We have right, taken back the Western Wall. Let's fuse this into a new type of ideology. Right now, we think of it as the religious Zionist movement that talks about Zionism as a mechanism for religion, which again is based off of Rav Kook, but this starts to proliferate after 67. And one of the most important and direct ways that this manifests itself on the ground is what today we would call settlements. So what is a settlement? A settlement is Israelis or Jews moving from what I'm going to call Israel proper, right? If anybody doesn't like my language here, feel free to unmute yourself and tell me your preferred language. Moving from Israel proper to areas that Israel has not annexed, but that Israel has military control over. And so this was the Sinai before Israel gave it back. This was Gaza before Israel left in 2005. And most importantly, this was the West Bank. And so now you start to have tens and eventually hundreds of thousands of Israelis move over what's called the Green Line, right? The Green Line is the ceasefire border after, right, it was the armistice line after 49, but Israelis move over the Green Line and start to live under an area that is not under Israeli civic control, but under Israeli military control. And the reasons for this are twofold. One reason for the early settlement movement was because of a religious idea of, again, we are returning to the cities of Jewish history and the Bible and Tanakh and the Torah and all of these ideas that, again, from a Jewish historical religious perspective, make a ton of sense, right? When Jews have been dreaming about returning to the land of Israel, they were not dreaming of returning to Tel Aviv, which is a city that popped up in 1904 or something, right? They were dreaming about returning to Hebron, right? The city that, according to Jewish tradition, Abraham and Isaac and Yaakov and their wives, right, that they were all buried in. So you have a lot of religious, right, devout religious, I'll call them ideologues, moving with a secondary political mission of very, wisely, right? And I'm not attaching a morality to my term wise, but very wisely thinking to themselves and saying, hey, wait a minute, it kind of seems like Israel might eventually give this land back, maybe back to Jordan, or maybe to create an autonomous Palestinian state. If we set up little cities or settlements sprinkled around the West Bank, we can make it very difficult for Israel to ever actually create another state there, because we're basically going to be sprinkled throughout the West Bank, thereby ensuring that Israel never gives this land back in a peace treaty or for any other reasons. And both of these two names were the explicit goals of this new movement called Gush Emunim, which is just the collaboration of the righteous, or the junction of the righteous. And this, again, spearheads the religious Zionist movement to today, where roughly 500,000 Israeli Jews live in the West Bank. And again, you can kind of see this map here in terms of where a lot of the settlements are sprinkled, right? Anywhere in dark blue is Israeli settlements. Elaine, I see you have a comment there.
So,
There we go.
okay. There is a distinction with the Gush area because there were settlements there prior to the state in the Gush on that side. And the war threw them out. And the people that established those communities sent their wives and their children into Jerusalem, and they stayed there trying to protect the Gush, and they lost it. So when the war after 67 came, they came back to the Gush, the children of those founders, many of whose parents were killed or whose fathers were killed, to reestablish a community that existed before. The Israeli situation is very complex.
Yes.
Not all of them went into areas that were not there before.
Yes, I totally agree. And just for people that might not know, the Gush Etzion is this area down here, or actually, it's actually on this map here. Perfect. Right. So about 20 miles south of Jerusalem, right next to Beit Lechem or Bethlehem. And yes, you're 100% right that, you know, one of the more horrific things that actually happened in 1948 was sort of the last stand of Gush Etzion and sort of the murder of everybody who stayed there, which again, right, I'm not trying to make any of this simple, right? So I hope nobody leaves here by saying I oversimplified. I'm trying to do the opposite. It brings up a lot of really provocative questions over when is it fair to go back to land that was taken from you. And so to some extent, Gush Etzion, right? I personally, I'll give my opinion here, not the map. There is a difference, right? I'm not going to say exactly what the difference is between Gush Etzion and, let's say, moving to Ariel or other settlements, right? I'm not going to give a value judgment because, right, that's sort of a fool's game because, again, as you said, one was a Jewish area from, early 1990s until 1948. One was done for more ideological reasons. The reason why that gets complicated, and the reason why, again, this conflict has, there's always the but this on all sides, is that then if all sides started doing that, right, things would get complicated as they are, because all sides are doing that. And so you have a situation here where the settlement movement, from one point of view, and I'll give both points of view because I think they're important. And the reason why I actually have this question, are they legal? Let me just introduce this, and then I'll kind of go into this. Is that one of the big debates that Israel often has with the global community is over the legality of settlements. And in a very overly simplified manner, here are both sides. The UN and the EU and a lot of groups that say the settlements are illegal will quote the Geneva Convention, and they will say, if you have an occupying power, you shall not deport or transfer parts of your own civilian population into the territory it occupies. Now, what Israel says and what Israeli lawyers say are two things that are both true. Everyone here can judge how this mixes with the Geneva Convention. I am not an international lawyer. What they would say, one, is that Israel never moved any of its population over the Green Line. This was a bottom-up phenomenon, right? This isn't like, let's say, Russia invading Ukraine or Crimea, taking over land and then pushing its population there in order to fill it up with its own citizens as fast as it could. The settlement movement was an organic bottom-up movement that throughout most of Israeli history, the government actually opposed. And so most settlement activity in the 1960s and the 1970s, right, this point requires a little bit more nuance, but a lot of the settlements there were a bunch of people. I mean, some of the accounts of the setting up of some of these settlements are fascinating because you have 15 people that in the middle of the night take a station wagon up a hill, and the next day the Israeli government is patrolling and saying, what the heck are you doing here? And they have 5 families there, and they saying, well, you can't remove us now, right? We're here. And Israel doesn't want to, force its own citizens out. And so it becomes a settlement. And then, 40 years later, the population goes from 25 people to 2,500 people, and voila, you have a settlement. And so what a lot of people in Israel will tell you is that this was not a top-down political solution. The second thing that they'll say, which is equally, if not more important, is that this was a defensive war. And perhaps those that were worrying about situations of occupying powers and wars and Geneva Conventions, what they had in mind was probably a lot more like what we see now with Russia and Ukraine than what happened with Israel, right? An aggressive offensive move to take over land with the explicit intent of taking over and putting your civilian population there. What happened in Israel was it was a strictly defensive war. And so what Israeli lawyers and what, most Israelis that would defend the settlement project would say, without giving my own opinion on either side, is what they would say is that this was a purely defensive war, right? Even if we wanted to give back the land, who would we give it to, right? And this isn't a tongue-in-cheek, there's no, because oftentimes if you go far enough right, you start to hear comments of, oh, well, there's no such thing as, Palestine or Palestinians. But Jordan, to some extent, was also illegally taking over the area, right? The UN never voted to have a country called Jordan. Just after the dust settled, after the war, there ended up just being a national country called Jordan. And so to some extent, the land was never anybody's. It was always sort of up for grabs. And Israel in a defensive war ends up taking it over. Ruth, go for it.
In our Jewish Film Festival here in New Jersey, we showed a film called Mayor, which is about the mayor of Ramallah, who happens to be Christian. But one of the problems they were having was that, Ramallah is a pretty big city, a Palestinian city. But the settlers were they were breaking into and diverting the water to go to their settlements. So, some of these, and some of them are very ultra religious, and they declare that this is their land and they don't give a damn about anybody else. But I remember he was trying to, avert a terrible confrontation, but it was because the settlers had diverted the water supply.
Yeah. And sadly, situations like that happen a good amount. And again, this is, this whole thing to some extent, right? And it doesn't, and one of the interesting things actually in modern day Israel is actually the right and the left would both agree with what I'm about to say. I'm talking about the right and left within Israel, right? Not to even mention, right, once you get into the global right and left, but the Israeli right and left both agree the current situation makes no sense. Right. This is, what Micha Goodman was getting at, because if you're on the right and you view the West Bank as part of Israel, you should want it to be part of Israel. Right. Which is why every couple of years you get right wing politicians. Right. I think Bibi mentioned this 2 years ago. Right. Maybe we'll try to annex some of it or something like that. If you're on the left, you don't think, right, Israel should be there at all. And so you want Israel to pull out. And so everybody views the current situation as both politically unsensical and ethically unsensical to some extent. Just nobody can figure out exactly what to do, because you have, all these set of dominoes, and the second anything happens, right, you're sort of perched on the abyss. And Israeli politicians are too afraid, and I'm not saying afraid facetiously, like, oh, if I was there, I can make a better decision. Afraid for good reason, because to some extent, there is no good, to some extent, grand solution. There's obviously policy proposals. One of the things that actually Micha Goodman, he also wrote a really interesting article for The Atlantic, and it was called 8 Steps to Reduce the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, which is a great article, right? For anyone listening, if you're interested in this, highly recommend it, where he talks about 8 policy positions that can mitigate scenarios like what Ruth described. But you have, it's really tough to know exactly what to do, right? And one of the things that, is pointed to a lot, right? We'll discuss this either a little bit later, or, we have one more class, and maybe we'll do the next 40 years eventually during that class. In the year 2005, Israel pulls out from the Gaza Strip. And right, there's been a lot written on why exactly Israel pulled out, right? Was this a gesture of peace, right? Was this a, brilliant political move? Was it a civilian move, right? You can let the pundits debate on that. But immediately after Israel pulls out of the Gaza Strip, it's taken over by the terrorist group Hamas. And now Gaza is, has been turned into a terrorist-sponsored rocket launch site that's backed by Iran. And so this is viewed, right, correctly so, in my opinion, by a lot of people on the right, as saying, well, it would probably be a really bad idea tomorrow to just pull out of, all of our military in the West Bank. On the other hand, I think a lot of the ethical criticism of what's happening, just a nod to what Ruth was saying, but there's myriads of other examples, are also true, which again just goes back to this sort of Catch 67 that I think Micha Goodman writes a lot about. Any other comments or questions here about the aftermath of 67? Again, it is worth dwelling on this point because we can endlessly go around, and I think virtually all sides, I think, can be, all sides within reason can be defended or attacked, rightfully so. Bilal, go for it.
So I believe it was something that Elaine said that kind of made me think a little bit. She said something about the settlements that were there prior to the war, and that these settlements that are now newfoundly established, they're on the premise that they were previously there prior to the war. Did I hear that correct? Because I believe you were in agreement with that statement. And you were talking about the Gush. I believe it was the Gush.
That was before the state was established, I believe.
Okay.
There were people living all over what was considered in Palestine before 48. So
and because okay, I'm sorry.
So the Gush was established during that period of time. Then the war came, and that's the result of the war.
Okay, and that's see, this is new information for me, and I'm curious because the reason I ask this is if this was the premise for why they're establishing the settlements today, or in the near future, based on the idea or the concept that these settlements were in existence prior. Now, wouldn't it be fair to assume that the Palestinians were pushed out of their land, as far as I believe the Palestinian diaspora is, with the ones that were displaced and kicked out of their homes? So only reason I ask is because it seems like this is a counterintuitive to what is going on in Israel.
Yeah, I think so. Let me just pop in with an answer, and Elaine, you're welcome to add. I think your point is sort of the one that I was trying to make before, which is this is my opinion here. I'm sure there's 19 people left in the Zoom call. I'm sure you'll get 19 strong opinions here, maybe even 20, depending on the day, where claims to land in modern day Israel based off of 10, 15, 20 years ago. I think when both sides try to make in my opinion, they're untenable on both sides, because I think if both sides keep playing that calling card, you just end up collapsing the foundation of everything. So on the one hand, and this is again why I think modern day Israel is filled with tensions. On the one hand, I do think historical living in a land gives you some claim to a land. On the other hand, it can't be complete claim to a land, because given the history of Israel, and I'm not just talking about the last 100 years, the last 3,000 years, there's been 40 different empires that have lived in Jerusalem. And so if they all start showing up and knocking on the door and saying, hey, actually, this was ours in the 8th century, and actually, we had this in the 13th century, right? Obviously, that's untenable, but yet it might be true. And so I often, this is, I think, why the Israeli-Palestinian conflict ends up being so difficult, is that both of the nationalistic and to some extent even the maximalistic claims have truth to it, and yet they can't coexist at the same time, which is why, and we're not going to have time to get into Yitzhak Rabin, at least now, right? We'll hopefully next week. I didn't realize this 75 years of history would take this long, although everyone that I mentioned today that I'm going to do 75 years of Israeli history in an hour and a half laughed at me. Now I understand why. one of the things that you start to see coming out of the Israeli left and Yitzhak Rabin and the Oslo Accords is exactly what I just said. And the Peace Now movement that, again, was extremely popular in the 1980s and early 1990s said, okay, you have two different groups that have maximalistic claims that can't coexist. The obvious solution that would make everybody upset, but at least stops bloodshed, is two-state solution. Now, for a whole variety of reasons, that never took off. And there were still a whole series of strong disagreement points about, well, what do you do about Jerusalem? And what do you do about right of return? And what do you do about reparations? And what do you do about this and that? But that exactly, right, that conversation to some extent, I think, is exactly the trajectory of a lot of Israelis. And just the last thing I'll say here, and then I think we'll hold up until our next class is on Monday, which is also going to be our last class. So we can do 30 minutes of finishing up Israel history, and then I want to talk for another like 30 minutes and discuss what I'm calling the future of Judaism, because we spent 18 or 19 weeks studying history. Is one of the next really important events in Israel's history, and we'll discuss this more on Monday, is the First Intifada, which was in 1987. And the reason why the First Intifada ends up being transformative is oftentimes, right, at least when a lot of people today hear Intifada, they immediately think of the Second Intifada, which was sort of the representation of the Second Intifada is suicide bombings and buses blowing up and pizza shops blowing up and bloodshed and chaos all throughout Israel. The First Intifada, interestingly enough, was a lot less, there obviously still was violence, but the First Intifada to some extent was an awakening for a lot of Israelis about the fact that the status quo from 1967 to 1987 is not going to be able to remain indefinitely. And there's a lot of really interesting, analyses of this, that the First Intifada is what ended up convincing, say, Yitzhak Rabin that he has to reach out to the PLO and actually begin a talks of a two-state solution, because it was sort of exactly what you're saying was, okay, you had 15, 20 years to figure it out. All of a sudden, this problem can't be sort of outsourced, right? It's at your front door. One of the people who actually writes really beautifully about this is the Israeli author Yossi Klein Halevi, who wrote my absolute favorite book about Israel. I'll just plug this real quick. Is his book Like Dreamers. I'm going to write that in the chat because he writes a book basically describing the aftermath of the 6-Day War. And he writes explicitly about the First Intifada. Is that's what sort of woke him up from this idea of carrying on in the status quo indefinitely to all of a sudden realizing that, okay, there needs to be something, which it also did to the majority of Israelis, right? And just one data point here, if you took polling in Israel in the year, let's say 1985, and you asked Israeli Jews, do you support the establishment of a Palestinian state, right, in a two-state solution? I'm going to make up numbers here. So, if anybody actually has the data, just a forewarning there. I would guess it would be under 1%. By the mid-90s, right, as a result of the First Intifada and Rabin and Oslo, right, if you ask people in 1994, that number shoots up, right? I don't want to give an exact number, but, right, it might have even been 40 or 50% of Israel that said, hey, actually, I think this is a good idea. And today, the numbers are probably equivalent, right? If you ask, let's say, if you ask all Zionists in the world, do you support a two-state solution? Even though a lot of them might say, well, that might never happen. If you would support it in theory, right, that is because of a lot of these issues that I think were brought up there. We aren't going to move on in any slides. So if anybody has any other comments or questions, Ruth put in Ari Shavit's My Promised Land. I think we mentioned that a couple weeks ago. Also, right? That's a really interesting book for more of the Israeli left-wing opinion, but that is also in the top 20 books to read about Israel section. Any other questions, comments, statements, any of this? This is also very classic, I think, conversation about Israel, where we set off to discuss 75 years, and I think we made it about 19 years. So this is great. Perfect. Well, thank you all, everybody. Again, a happy Yom Ha'atzmaut week. I think Yom Ha'atzmaut ended now a full day ago. And we will be back on Monday at 5:30 with the next 50 years of Israel history, which I promise will move a little bit faster than the first 18 years. And then we will conclude this 20-week class of our journey through Jewish history.
Night, everybody.